The Warlord never saw the third car. It glided out of the rain like a shadow with headlights, blocking the convoy at the narrowest bend of the mountain road above Beirut. And in that instant, every intelligence service that mattered on the planet held its breath. Down the hill, in a darkened safe house wired with monitors, a Central Intelligence Agency team leader whispered into his headset that this was their moment, their snatch, their hard-earned prize after years of tracking sand and blood. But on the ridge above, behind a row of rusted satellite dishes, a very different voice murmured in Hebrew, giving a calm count that did not match the American timing at all. Here is your hook. 2 Allied services, 1 high-value terrorist warlord, and only one of them will leave this night with him alive. Before we go any further, answer this in the comments right now. If 2 so-called allies hunt the same monster, who should own the operation? The agency that followed the rules, or the one willing to break them in the dark? The warlord at the center of this storm, Khalid al-Nadir, to his family and comrades, had been moving like a ghost for years, slipping between war zones and diplomatic no-go zones, always one step ahead of drones and indictments. To his followers, he was the Lion of the Valley, a commander who turned shattered villages into armies and smuggling routes into lifelines. To the Central Intelligence Agency, he was a nightmare with a ledger, personally linked to bombings that had erased embassies and convoys from maps, and to cash flows that fueled cells across continents. To the Mossad desk officers who watched his silhouette flicker across grainy feeds, he was something else entirely. A long, delayed debt that reached back to bus explosions and market massacres that Tel Aviv still carried in its bones. On that rain-slick night, the Central Intelligence Agency believed it had finally boxed him in. Sealed deal with host country police, diplomatic cover for extraction, a legal framework that could survive a congressional hearing. What the Americans did not know was that months earlier, a small Israeli unit had quietly opened a competing file stamped with an internal code name that translated roughly to Operation Borrowed Fire. The unspoken mandate was simple and lethal. If the Central Intelligence Agency could not or would not remove the Lion of the Valley from the battlefield, Israel would steal him, body and soul, right out from under the noses of its closest ally. Khalid al-Nadir had not been born a warlord. He had come into the world in a dusty village on the edge of a forgotten border, in the late years of the 20th century when maps were being redrawn faster than his family could understand. As a boy, he watched soldiers from 3 flags march through his home within a single year, each promising order and leaving ruins. To his mother, he remained the quiet eldest son who stole books from the mission school and whispered verses under his breath. To the armed movement that eventually claimed him, he became the engineer. The man who could look at a broken supply chain and turn it into an artery for weapons and money. He studied logistics in a foreign capital under a false scholarship, learned to speak the language of cargo manifests and offshore accounts, and then returned to the conflict zones with a new understanding of how to keep a war running even when the world pretended it was over. For the Central Intelligence Agency, Khalid was a threat not because he carried a rifle, but because he knew how to move men, explosives, and cash across embargoes and sanction regimes as if they were notes in a song. They labeled him a global facilitator, the kind of man Senate hearings mention when they talk about networks that cannot be bombed. For Mossad, however, Khalid was more than a facilitator. In Tel Aviv files, his name was linked to attacks that had killed children on buses and families in cafes, operations that his faction had funded, planned, or at least protected. Every time an Israeli analyst traced a wire transfer back to a shell company in some port city, Khalid's name floated up like oil in dirty water. What made him so hard to reach was not only his security bubble of loyal fighters, decoy vehicles, and rotating safe houses, but also his habit of embedding himself where he knew Western agencies would hesitate. Inside crowded refugee districts, near diplomatic compounds, inside countries that traded secrets for aid packages. To his relatives, he was a battered uncle who showed up once a year with gifts and stories. To the conflict journalists who glimpsed him at funerals, he looked like a tired, middle-aged man with pale scars around his eyes. Only those who watched the satellite feeds understood that every time his convoy moved, a dozen task forces in half a dozen capitals held their breath and recalculated what might happen if he vanished. The decision to stop merely watching Khalid and to lay hands on him did not emerge from a single dramatic meeting. It seeped through layers of bureaucracy like pressure through old concrete. In Washington, after yet another bombing tied to Khalid's network, a classified briefing turned into a quiet push from the National Security Council. The Central Intelligence Agency's Near East Division was told, in the politely lethal language of interagency memos, that leaving the engineer at large was no longer acceptable. A joint working group drafted options that ranged from targeting his convoy with a missile to luring him onto an aircraft that never reached its declared destination. Lawyers weighed in, underlining the difference between capture for trial and assassination in a sovereign country that still pretended to be neutral. European partners murmured concern about public backlash if another shadow operation splashed across headlines. In the end, the Central Intelligence Agency opted for a clean capture on friendly soil, a snatch in a nominal ally's territory wrapped in legal understandings and deniable help from local security services. Somewhere in Tel Aviv, the same intelligence feeds sparked a very different conversation. Israel's political leadership had grown weary of dossiers that called Khalid an indirect funder, a facilitator, a supporter. In their internal language, he was something far simpler. The architect, whose money and orders had left citizens dead in buses and nightclubs. Around a long table in a secure room, senior officers from the Mossad presented two paths. One was to support the American plan and feed them intel, securing a seat at the eventual interrogation and perhaps influence over charges. The other was to mount a parallel operation with a sharper edge, one that would ensure Khalid disappeared into an Israeli-controlled black hole, rather than a courtroom with cameras. The codename Operation Borrowed Fire was approved with a single sentence from a prime minister who remembered too many funerals. This was the bureaucratic sleight of hand that turned allies into quiet competitors. On paper, Israel cooperated, sharing just enough data to stay inside the warm circle of trust. Off the record, a small team inside the Mossad's most clandestine division received orders that could never be written down. Shadow the Central Intelligence Agency, exploit their groundwork, then get to Khalid first, whatever it took, and ensure that when the dust settled, the Americans would be left asking how an entire operation had been stolen in front of their cameras. Once both services had committed, the conflict moved into the world of pattern tracking, of tiny human habits that matter more than speeches. The Central Intelligence Agency had spent years mapping Khalid's routes, pinning colored threads across a digital globe, from safe houses in the Levant to medical clinics in the Gulf and discreet apartments in North African capitals. They knew that he refused commercial flights, preferring overland travel with hand-picked drivers. They knew he distrusted luxury hotels, but trusted mid-range chains that were crowded enough to hide in, but secure enough to keep out random thieves. Their analysts had identified a recurring pattern. Every few months, Khalid disappeared into a particular Mediterranean city for medical treatment under a false identity, always in the same cluster of neighborhoods, always near a certain private clinic that never seemed to advertise yet was never empty. Mossad stepped into this map like a silent second player. They were not just watching where Khalid went, they were watching how he moved, what he trusted, and when he relaxed, leaning hard into the template that had guided so many of their past operations. They noticed that his security team always booked rooms 2 floors below him, never above. They noticed that he insisted on walking to nearby mosques at dawn without a full convoy, believing that the sanctity of prayer and the narrow alleys around the old quarter would protect him. They noticed that the Central Intelligence Agency advance team favored certain hotels with good fire exits and discreet service elevators, and that these hotels, in turn, had long-standing maintenance contracts with a foreign company that changed staff regularly, often without local authorities paying much attention. Mossad officers began posing as auditors from that company, inspecting boiler rooms and camera feeds, mapping blind spots. A female case officer spent days in the hotel lobby as an overworked event planner, learning which security guards were bored, which receptionists liked to gossip late at night, and which floor managers could be bribed with a foreign school scholarship for a relative. Meanwhile, Israeli signals specialists parked 2 streets away in a battered van that looked like any contractor's vehicle, quietly harvesting the device chatter of the Central Intelligence Agency team. They learned the rhythms of American briefings, the calls back to Langley, the way the team leader's voice tightened when locals were late. The plan, on both sides, gravitated toward the same location, a particular hotel overlooking the harbor, with a service entrance that opened onto an alley no one bothered to patrol. The difference lay in timing and nerve. The Central Intelligence Agency planned a dawn corridor snatch on the day Khalid was scheduled to leave. Bag over the head, local police at the stairs, diplomatic plates waiting in the basement. Mossad, watching from the edges, designed something far bolder, an extraction inside the night itself, cutting into the hours when even allies assume nothing decisive will happen and cameras are more likely to be misdirected. The planning for Operation Borrowed Fire did not look glamorous. It looked like endless rehearsals in a warehouse outside Tel Aviv, a mocked-up hotel corridor built to scale from stolen blueprints, doors with weights calibrated to match the real hinges, fluorescent tape on the floor to mark where every team member had to stand when the count hit 0. The chosen unit was a small cell drawn from one of Israel's most experienced clandestine teams, veterans of overseas snatches and extractions, who were as comfortable in business suits as in combat gear. Their roles were brutally clear. 2 would pose as hotel maintenance, complete with stained coveralls and plastic ID badges cloned from the real staff. 1 would be a tired-looking night manager walking the corridors as if checking on noise complaints. A 4th would wait in the service elevator with a collapsible wheelchair and a folded travel blanket, ready to transform a sedated warlord into a sick relative being rushed to a clinic. The tools were simple but precise. Fake passports from 3 different countries, a set of electronic keys cloned from the hotel's system, a small medical kit containing a fast-acting sedative that would erase consciousness without leaving obvious marks, and a cluster of tiny jamming devices designed to freeze the corridor cameras for less than a minute without triggering obvious alarms. They rehearsed every scenario. What if a drunk tourist stumbled into the corridor? What if the Central Intelligence Agency team decided to move early? What if Khalid refused to open the door to anyone but his core guards? If anything broke the pattern beyond what they had drilled, they would abort, retreat into their covers, and let the Americans take the heat of a failed attempt. The brilliance of the plan lay in its cruel leverage. Mossad did not have to penetrate Khalid's circle from scratch. They only had to slip into the gaps the Central Intelligence Agency had already created. They counted on the Americans to pressure hotel management into certain room allocations, to lean on local police to quietly thin patrols in the area, to ensure that elevators and service corridors would be mysteriously free at key times. All of this made the building itself softer, quieter, easier to manipulate. On the chosen night, a storm rolled in from the sea, flattening the city's usual noise under sheets of rain. In the Central Intelligence Agency safe house, the team leader decided that the bad weather suited them, giving cover to their dawn plan. In the Mossad warehouse, the storm was treated as a sign that they had been given a cloak of their own. Minutes before midnight, 4 Israelis stepped into the hotel through the staff entrance, nodded at a bored guard whose overtime had been quietly arranged days earlier, and took their positions in the living chessboard of carpets and numbered doors. Somewhere above them, Khalid al-Nadir believed he had one more night of rest before he would have to move again. What happened next would be argued about in classified rooms for years afterward. In the small hours before dawn, the corridor on Khalid's floor was almost empty. The cameras on that level flickered, their feeds looping a few seconds of harmless footage that had been recorded earlier in the night. A man in a maintenance uniform wheeled a cleaning cart down the hallway, humming tunelessly. From another direction, the supposed night manager approached with a folder of fabricated complaints in his hand. Inside his suite, Khalid had just finished a call to one of his lieutenants, reassuring him that the Americans were still hesitating, that no one would risk a full-scale operation in this city. without tipping their hand. When the knock came, it was light but insistent, the kind hotel staff use when a guest has ignored several calls from the front desk. According to the version that filtered back through whispers, the sequence was almost unnervingly smooth. The door opened a fraction, enough for one of Khalid's guards to see the night manager's face and the counterfeit badge. A complaint about water pressure, a request to check the bathroom, a half step inward. The guard relaxed, just enough. A second man in maintenance gear slid in behind the first, one hand on the cart, the other on a small device that would later be described only as a medical tool. There was a brief noise, a soft thud rather than a shout, and then the suite was full of controlled movement. The sedative entered Khalid's bloodstream under the cover of a polite handshake, disguised as the sting of a ring clipping his knuckle. Within heartbeats, his knees buckled, and the men around him were forced to decide whether to shoot or to trust the eyes that met theirs, eyes that promised instant death if any weapon cleared leather. Whatever calculation they made it too slowly. When the elevator doors opened onto the service level, a pale, middle-aged man slumped in a wheelchair under a travel blanket, accompanied by a harried relative and a doctor who snapped at staff about blood pressure and urgent tests. By the time the Central Intelligence Agency team triggered their own plan at dawn, bursting through a now empty door with local police at their backs, the Warlord was already in the belly of a diplomatic van, crawling toward an airfield under foreign plates. The discovery was humiliating. On paper, local authorities logged a minor disturbance and a guest who had checked out early. The Central Intelligence Agency's internal report spoke of a compromised operation, suspected leaks, and the possibility of hostile intelligence involvement. In regional media, rumors swirled of a warlord who had vanished, of foreign jets seen leaving at strange hours, of a host government angrily summoning ambassadors behind closed doors. Officially, Israel said nothing. Unofficially, Allied services took note. It proved that Mossad could reach into the heart of an American-run operation, use its structure, and still walk away with the prize, turning an ally's caution into their own advantage. But it also removed a calculating tactician and left room for younger lieutenants who were less restrained, more ideological, more willing to burn cities instead of merely bleeding them. In the end, the story of how Mossad stole a terrorist warlord from under the Central Intelligence Agency's nose leaves a question hanging over every viewer. When democracies outsource justice to covert teams and play competitive games even with their allies, does eliminating one man make the world safer, or does it simply push the violence deeper into shadows where no law can reach? Drop your answer in the comments. And if this operation changed the way you think about alliances, power, and the secret wars fought in your name, share this story and stay with us, because there are many more missions that governments deny, and we are going to drag them, one by one, into the light.